Those of you who are familiar with our space know that I'm now teaching virtually from the SAR High School Library lobby. So Rabbi Kroll spoke to you about some of the halachic aspects of thinking about the pandemic. I, pulling out a little bit from a specific focus on this circumstance and this event, wanted to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about times when the government of the United States has been confronted with mass death, with death on a large scale, how the federal government has reacted or responded to that, and ways in which that has shifted the relationship of the federal government to the American people, or what sort of longer term or broader impact the federal government response in that circumstance had. I do have a slideshow to show you. However, when I'm sharing it, you can't see me. So we're probably going to spend some time going back and forth between sharing the screen and talking to you. So we probably assume when we think about the federal government that it can basically do whatever it wants, that it can make laws about whatever area it wants to make laws about, that it can act in any way that it wants to act. The reason we assume that is because we see the federal government as a very active force in our lives in all sorts of ways. But that actually doesn't reflect the structure of the federal government that was set up originally in the Constitution. And that's the product of an evolution in the role of the federal government that takes place over centuries. When the government of, well, the states become independent of Britain in 1776. Yeah, right? We remember that? July 4th, that thing. The states become independent in 1776. Our Constitution is written in 1787 and ratified in 1789. And that means that the 13 states are independent entities. They had tried an earlier form of government called the Articles of Confederation. That turned out not to work so well. They are independent entities that come together in a compact called the Constitution of the United States. But because of that history and that structure, although the Constitution creates a central government, it does not completely replace or take over all of the powers of the states. And so we have a federal system that we still live with today, in which some of the powers are held by the central government, some of the powers are held by the states, and some of the powers are shared. And you all know this because we've been having endless conversations now about what part of pandemic response, what part of testing is the responsibility of the central government, what part of it is the response of the states, who's supposed to be doing what. And I just tried to screen share and, oh, there we go. Great. I tried to screen share and it even worked. So I'm just going to skip ahead for a second because I'm going to drop out of order. So federalism, that first concept I have up there is the idea that we have these two different levels of government, the central government and the states, and there are powers that are divided between them. And these powers have names. So the first set of powers are the delegated or enumerated powers. Those are powers that belong to the central government. And as we're going to see in a minute, they're called the enumerated powers because they're enumerated, they're listed in the Constitution. The reserved powers are the powers that are reserved to the states, and the shared powers are the powers that are shared between them, most notably the power of taxation. You probably know that both the federal government and the states get to tax you, lucky all of us. So the powers of the federal government, we are actually going to look specifically at the powers of the legislative branch of Congress. These are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And I actually just want to stop there for a second and sit with that, because I think we probably assume that Congress can do whatever it wants. It can make laws about whatever it wants. But actually, according to the Constitution, Congress can only make laws about specific areas of government activity. And here are those areas. It can lay taxes. It can borrow money on the credit of the United States. It can regulate commerce among states and with foreign nations. It can coin money. It can punish counterfeiters. It can establish post offices and post roads. It's actually a specific power of Congress. Great. Patent law and copyright law to promote the progress of science and useful arts, to set up courts, to punish piracy. That's a good one. To declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, and to make any laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry out the previous laws. That's very lovely. You're going to see there that there is nothing at all about running an old age pension system like Social Security. There's nothing at all about running a healthcare system for people who are elderly, Medicare, or people who are poor, Medicaid. There is nothing there, right? You get that. There's nothing there about a lot of things that the federal government does today. And so the process of getting from the federal government that's kind of described in the Constitution, which is with this very circumscribed set of responsibilities to the federal government we have today, is a process of the government over time increasing its sphere of activity, increasing what it does and how it does it. And there are a lot of important inflection points in the relationship between the federal government and the states, but certainly one of them is the Civil War, and we're going to start there talking about that. Needless to say, the Civil War happens because some states say, yeah, about that federal Constitution thing, we opted into it, we can opt out of it, and Abraham Lincoln says, yeah, I don't think so, and that gets us a Civil War. And the Civil War is a monumental conflict with enormous consequences. And today I want to talk about just one particular aspect of that. It is hard for us to imagine the scale of death and dying in the Civil War. For a very long time, historians said that the number of people who died in the Civil War was about 620 or so thousand. That was usually the number that we used. Our best estimates now are actually that's a substantial undercount. William Faulkner said that in the South, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. So the Civil War is not even past. This is a story from 2012 about new estimates raising the Civil War death toll because the numbers that we had, the data that we had about the number of deaths out from the Civil War were always very inaccurate. Close to half of the Civil War dead were never identified. Numbers were just really bad. People were often buried in mass graves or not buried, unidentified graves. And so what a team of historians did is that they went back and looked very carefully at data from the 1860 census and then data from the 1870 census, and they said who's missing, which is an interesting way to try to figure out who's dead. And then they looked at the differences between number of men missing and number of women missing, because it was just coincidence you'd expect the numbers of men and women missing to be about the same. And where they found excess numbers of men missing, they attributed those deaths between 1860 and 1870 to the Civil War. And from their numbers, they come up with an estimate of maybe 750,000 to 800,000 deaths in the Civil War, at a time when the population of the United States was about 31 million. The population of the United States now is more than 10 times that. So if you think about an equivalent death toll today, you're talking about 7.5, 8 million Americans dead. It's an enormous number of people who are dead. This is something we've always known, even if we didn't know exactly how high the number was, even if we thought it was 620 or 630,000 Americans, that's still a lot of dead Americans. But not all that long ago, an historian named Drew Gilpin-Faust, who was actually, whoops, went the wrong direction. Let's back ourselves up. Who was the first woman to be the president of Harvard University, published a really outstanding book called This Republic of Suffering, Death, and the American Civil War, in which she looked at the ways in which the sheer mass scale of death in the Civil War changed all kinds of things for the American people. And in the book, she talks about all sorts of things. She talks about the ways in which it challenged people's faith and religion. I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'll tell you one of my even though it's not relevant to the federal government, one of my favorite facts from that book that I taught my students when I taught American history. At that time in the 1860s, among the genteel classes, there was a practice that when you had lost somebody close to you, a woman wore what was called mourning. And wearing mourning meant you wore all black for a certain period of time. And then after that, you graduated out from mourning to half mourning, which meant that you could wear black with accents of gray or lavender, a few other colors. And then eventually you had moved out of your period of mourning, you went back to wearing normal clothing. So many people died in the Civil War. So many women were wearing mourning that the Lord and Taylor department store, which predates the Civil War, actually had a separate mourning wear department. They had an entire department devoted to selling mourning because so many women were wearing mourning. So that's the scale of death in the Civil War. So sometimes you find interesting historical works because there was a question you always had and you didn't know the answer to, and somebody went and looked it up and they found you the answer. But really brilliant history asks a question that you never even thought about, you didn't know was a question, and then they answer it. And so what Drew Faust does in that book is she says, we never asked physically, what did they do with all of those hundreds of thousands of dead bodies? How did they identify them, move them, return them home, bury them? Who took responsibility for them? Who was managing the cemeteries? And what she actually discovers is that there's an enormously important transition that happens over the course of the war. Because in the beginning of the Civil War, it was literally every man for himself. There was no organized system, not for identifying the dead, not for returning remains, not for burying the dead. Soldiers would go into battle, pinning their addresses to their coats so that if they died, at least somebody could notify their parents so their parents would know. There were for-profit embalmers who followed behind the, this is so grim. There were for-profit embalmers who followed the battles and would then embalm the dead, and you'd have to pay them if you wanted to get your loved one back. And at some point, Americans said to the federal government, this is not cool. We're being asked to sacrifice and have our loved ones die in war. You should be taking more responsibility for honoring the remains of fallen soldiers. And so the federal government establishes something called the Sanitary Commission and begins to try to have systematic efforts to identify the dead, systematic efforts to bury the dead. Remains were actually often not returned. That was usually officers. Regular soldiers were buried where they fell, which is how you end up, for example, with you know, vast military cemeteries at Gettysburg and other places where there were large battles. But the federal government starts to establish cemeteries and take responsibility for the maintenance of the cemeteries. That happens a little bit during the war. There's a handful of cemeteries established during the war. And then really more significantly after the war, when you're less busy fighting, you can spend more time where many sets of remains were disinterred and reburied. And there was an effort to build cemeteries that were, you know, honoring, that were worthy of the sacrifice of those who were buried in them, and to restore the graves, and in other ways have the federal government take responsibility for actually physically maintaining the final resting place of these soldiers. I'll just say one more thing about Civil War cemeteries before we go on. The most famous cemetery established during the Civil War, of course, is Arlington National Cemetery. And there's a particular interesting history to Arlington National Cemetery, which is that the estate in Arlington, Virginia, that became the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, was actually the home of Robert E. Lee. And when he left the employ of the United States Army and went off to become the commanding general of the Confederacy, that wasn't really viewed so fondly by the United States Army. And so later on, when they took possession of his house in Virginia, just across the river from Washington, D.C., they turned his home into a cemetery. And by the time he came back from war, he could no longer reoccupy his home because it had become a cemetery. But so one of the things that false documents, in addition to the religious implications of the scale of death and the fashion implications of the scale of death, is the way that Americans demanded of their government that it do a better job taking care of their dead, identifying their dead, returning the remains of some of the dead, burying the remains of others of the dead, and then later maintaining the cemeteries. And that ongoing federal government effort, she says, which involved maintaining the cemeteries, because as I said to you, many of the cemeteries were located in the battlefields. The remains of most soldiers were not sent home. The federal government now was an active presence all across the United States, maintaining these cemeteries, these military cemeteries, where the Civil War dead were buried. And so the first case that we've just talked about is the case of the Civil War, scale of mass death in the Civil War, and the way that the federal government was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into taking a different level of responsibility for not only the physical needs, but actually kind of the moral and social needs of Americans to feel like fallen soldiers and their resting places were respectable and were honorable, and were worthy of their sacrifice. So that was the first case we were going to talk about. The second case we were going to talk about the relationship of the national government to the people of the United States, and what we can see in the ways that it changes and plays out at a time of mass death, is the one that also hits closest to home. And that is the Spanish influenza of 1918, the flu pandemic of 1918. And actually the very fact that it's called the Spanish influenza is indicative of precisely the thing that we're going to speak about. The pandemic did not originate in Spain. It was not Spanish in origin. However, the pandemic originated in the waning months of World War I. I'm just going to stop for a second and answer a question that came in about, was I referring to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? I was not referring specifically to the Tomb of the Unknown. I was referring to the whole scope and sweep of federal government cemeteries for Civil War soldiers, an enormous percentage of whom were unknown. Almost half. If you go to Gettysburg today, if you walk through a Civil War cemetery today, almost half of the remains are unidentified. And again, that was because there was not yet, forget DNA testing, which obviously the science didn't exist. There wasn't a system of dog tags. There wasn't a system of comprehensive identification of soldiers or of comprehensive notification of families, certainly not early in the war. They got better at it later on. They said that officers were responsible. When you had a battle like Gettysburg, that by the end of the 3 days of the battle, July 3rd, 1863, you have thousands and thousands of, I mean, just to be frank about it, dead bodies rotting in the heat of July days on a battlefield in Pennsylvania. They just buried them all as quickly as they could in first in mass graves, and then they reburied them later on. And so you have enormous numbers of unidentified dead in the Gettysburg Cemetery as in other cemeteries. Yes, huge private industry transporting and maintaining bodies. Yes, I mentioned the skeevy embalmers who made lots of money embalming remains. And then it kind of sounds like, I don't know if you ever read one of these stories. I'm sorry, this is terrible. I don't know if you ever read one of these stories about skeevy movers who, you know, they pack all your stuff up onto the truck and then they kind of hold your truck hostage and they won't give it back to you unless you give them more money than you agreed upon. But that was the kind of thing that skeevy embalmers were doing. They would embalm someone's loved one and then say, well, actually the price is triple what I told you and I'm not giving him back until you give me more money. And there were all kinds of complaints filed. One of the sources that Faust is working off of in her history is complaints that were filed with various army officers about these unscrupulous embalmers and their methods. Okay, let's go back to the Spanish flu. Spanish flu pandemic begins in the waning months of World War I, and that turns out to be very significant. Because it is wartime, in order to meet the needs and exigencies of wartime, there is military censorship in place of the press and of the news. You will recall that when we looked at the powers of Congress, one of the powers was to declare war and various other powers connected to waging war. And we read down at the bottom the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, which said that Congress can also do anything that it finds necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers. And whenever the United States has been at war, it has found it necessary and proper to its conduct of the war to censor or suppress information that might in some way be detrimental to the war effort. This obviously makes good sense to us. You wouldn't really want somebody publicizing what it knew about troop movements or whatever else, printing that in the front page of the New York Times and letting the enemy find out about it. But it's really pretty obvious that once you give the government the power to censor the press and control what's published, that can land in all sorts of ways. And so when a flu pandemic began, when it first was found in a military camp outside of Boston, the government suppressed any information about that. The reason why the flu is known as the Spanish flu is that Spain was not a combatant in World War I, and because they were not combatants in World War I, and they weren't censoring their weren't censoring their press, they had open discussions about what, in their press, in the Spanish press, about the scale of the pandemic, which was not going on in the news in the combatant countries. I'm just skipping ahead to what we're up to here. And so there was a federal agency called the Committee on Public Information. That's a little bit of an Orwellian name, even though this is before Orwell, because it was a committee to keep information from the public. It controlled stories about the war. And its leader once said, the force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters very little if it is true or false. So Woodrow Wilson said nothing about the pandemic. The Surgeon General said it's no biggie. Another top health official said it's just the flu, it's not a big deal. And meanwhile, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were dying. So here is something that's really interesting in terms of what the government can or cannot do when it comes to controlling or suppressing information and to shaping the narrative. In the moment, the federal government could control what was printed in the newspapers. And that worked for some amount of time. And that was going to stop working pretty quickly when people you knew started dying, right? As soon as people you knew started dying, it didn't matter if the federal government wasn't letting you print stories in the newspaper, you knew that people were dying. Lots of people died from the flu pandemic. Okay, in the worst month of the pandemic, more people died in that 1 month than have died in the whole COVID pandemic so far, and at a time when the population of the country was significantly smaller, so proportionally it was a lot more death. So as soon as people close to you start dying, you know that people are dying, and it doesn't really matter if the federal government keeps those stories out of the press. But here's what they could do, and this is fascinating, if not inspirational, okay? They couldn't control the narrative at the time. Censorship and suppression of the truth didn't control the narrative of the time, but it has significantly shaped how the histories have been written. When we first started to pay attention to COVID-19 and then started to talk about Spanish flu, I said, you know, I teach American history. I've studied American history, spent a lot of time reading about American history, read very little about the Spanish flu. Why is that? And as you start to go back and look at it, why do I know so little about the flu pandemic of 1918? It turns out that when historians are looking for the raw material of history to write their history books from, they go to what's sometimes called the first draft of history, which is journalism. And if there are no stories in the newspaper, then later historians kind of assume it wasn't such a big deal. The people living at the time knew it was a big deal. They knew people who had died. But historians decades later who are going back to write about it, go look at the newspapers, and it's not in the newspapers, so it must not have been such a big story. And actually, the flu pandemic of 1918, when you go back and look at history books, gets barely a sentence in most of our survey books of American history, despite the enormous numbers of Americans that it killed and the enormous impact that it had on American life. And so if government censorship, if Woodrow Wilson censorship couldn't control how Americans thought about the pandemic in the moment, it suppressed the story for a few months, and then people started dying and people knew that was a story, but it actually had a significant impact in the long-term way that this was studied and understood, because it changed the raw material that was available for those people who were writing subsequent histories. And this was actually pretty interesting to me, because that particular question of what raw material is available to people writing histories, what do they have to draw on, and how does government censorship shape that, was actually a big chunk of what I wrote my doctoral dissertation about. Parents in SAR high school think that I did graduate work in enforcing dress code, but I actually did graduate work in the history of the Manhattan Project, which is a World War II project to develop the atomic bomb, in which there was also a great deal of censorship. And actually what I wrote about was how the censorship and the government's very careful decision about what information to release shaped not only the perception of the Manhattan Project at the time, but in significant ways how we have understood and thought about the Manhattan Project ever since, because only that which the government allowed us to know about the Manhattan Project was known at the time. And that in turn really has shaped certain stories about the Manhattan Project that we know and tell. And if you're interested in hearing more about this, I would be delighted to share a great deal more about it with you, but not right now. And so the story of the flu pandemic of 1918 is both about the limits of the power of federal government. You can't suppress a story when people know their neighbors are dying, but also in a certain way, the limits on those limits, because even if you can't suppress it at the time, if you shape what is available for that first draft of history, then you can in fact shape how the narrative is told in subsequent generations. So that's our second case that we were looking at. And the third case that we were looking at is the government's attempt to address the mass death of a different sort. It wasn't mass death of the Civil War, of hundreds of thousands of people dying on battlefields in the space of 4 years. And it wasn't the mass death of the flu pandemic, which was hundreds of thousands of people dying of a pandemic in the space of months. It instead was the mass deaths on the order of 5 figures, not 6 figures, a year, but year after year after year after year after year, as a result of people driving under the influence of alcohol, driving while intoxicated. It's hard to tell our students now who are, even before Uber was a thing, you know, now Uber is a thing, so you go to a party, then you just take an Uber home. But even before Uber was a thing, the culture of designated drivers, and you don't drive after you've been drinking, is so deeply ingrained that it's wildly irresponsible and dangerous and risky. And even if it's also irresponsible, dangerous, or risky for teenagers to be drinking, but they know that at least if they're doing that, they shouldn't drive. For them to understand the culture in which businessmen went out for lunch and drank with lunch and then drove their car home, and that was just kind of what it was. The same way that we accept other kinds of, we accept, gun violence in America and school shootings. And I don't know, it's just a thing that sometimes happens. There's not much we could do about it. People accepted drunk driving deaths as it's just a thing that happens. And people sometimes die because drivers are under the influence of alcohol, and there's not much we can do about it. And a really, really powerful grassroots campaign, which I'm sure you're aware of, called Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which has now changed their name because they're no longer mothers and they're no longer just about drunk driving. But Mothers Against Drunk Driving got started, founded by women who had lost loved ones to drunk drivers. And they began a campaign to push and pressure the government to do something to address drunk driving, and to push and pressure the federal government, the central government, the national government, to do something about drunk driving, which is all good, except that if you remember Article 1, Section 8, there's really nothing in there that gives the federal government authority over drunk driving, over alcohol, over drinking, over driving. All of those things are very much state powers. What age you can buy or consume alcohol, whether you can buy or consume alcohol, who can drive, right? We all know this. Our driving licensure is state by state. None of that is the federal government power. And even post the changes that came about as a result of the Civil War, the New Deal, the Great Society, waves of increasing centralization of governmental power, increasing federal government powers, it's not the federal government's power to say how old you have to be to drink or how much you can drink before you are considered intoxicated. Yes? So what are we going to do? What's the campaign? What's the strategy? And what the Mothers Against Drunk Driving pushed for in the early 1980s is a strategy that actually draws upon something that was first used by Richard Nixon in the 1970s. During the first oil shock in 1973, when OPEC turned off the spigots on oil and the price of gas skyrocketed, there were gas shortages, lines, and all of that, and they wanted to lower the national speed limit. If you drive at 55 instead of 65, you use less gas. That was going to help with the gas shortages. But the federal government does not have the power to order the states. Again, speed limits are a state thing. Federal government doesn't have the power to order the states to set speed limits. But Congress has a power in the Constitution, which I actually didn't read you in Article 1, Section 8. It's not in Article 1, Section 8 because it's framed as a negative power rather than Congress can do this. It's you can't do this. And what you can't do is you can't spend any money without an appropriation by Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. If the government wants to spend money, Congress has to pass an appropriations bill and appropriate the spending. And so Congress under Richard Nixon said, no problem. We can't tell you what your speed limit can be. We could just tell you you're not going to get federal highway dollars unless you lower your speed limit. Do we get that? That's a good move. Parents of teenagers, you got to start to think this way. I can't tell you what your speed limit can be. I can just tell you that unless you lower the speed limit to 55, you are going to lose federal highway funding. The federal highway bill, the bill that funds highways, is an enormous spending bill. It goes to all 50 states. It is a bag of goodies for all sorts of people, funding this one's road and that one's bridge. It's a great way as a senator to look good. You bring the pork back to your hometown, and the federal government is saying if you don't lower the speed limit, we are going to take away funding. Almost all states lowered the speed limit to 55. There were a few that resisted, usually states out west. The federal government has since, by the way, removed that restriction. You know that because you all live in states where the speed limit is above 55. I spent a few days last summer in Montana. There are places in Montana where the posted speed limit is 80. So you can only imagine when people are driving where the posted speed limit is 80. I had gone to Montana to spend a few days in Glacier National Park, and going native, I rented a pickup truck. So there I was driving my pickup truck around my Montana roads with the posted speed limit of 80, but that's all neither here nor there. So Mothers Against Drunk Driving adopted the same strategy, and the person they found to spearhead the strategy for them was Senator Frank Lautenberg. Some of you may remember that name, senator from New Jersey. And they did exactly the same strategy in a law that was passed in 1984. they said that no problem, states, we can't tell you what the drinking age should be. So we're just saying that if you don't raise your drinking age to 21, you will lose federal highway dollars. By now, the federal highway bill is like $100 billion a year. It's an enormous amount of money. And you will lose federal highway dollars if you don't raise the drinking age, at which point, unsurprisingly, state by state fell into line and raised the drinking age to 21. That's how the drinking age got raised to 21. It is not technically a federal drinking age. The federal government doesn't set the drinking age. It's a state drinking age, but each state was pulled into line by the power of the federal government's purse to raise its drinking age, and drinking age state by state is now 21. And that worked so well in 1984 when Mothers Against Drunk Driving pushed for it, that they went back for a second bite at the apple in 2000. Bill Clinton, on his way out, signed the 2001 appropriation for the Department of Transportation, but that was passed in October of 2001 appropriation for the Department of Transportation. And that said, oh, I have evidence, Rabbi Kroll. I have pictures of me. I don't know how to do it. I can't do it while I'm on Zoom to share pictures of me. You know what I can do? I bet you Rabbi Kroll doesn't think I have pictures of me in Montana and my pickup truck. I will find pictures of me in Montana and my pickup truck, and I will just do this the low-tech way. I will hold them up to the camera so that you can see me in Montana in my pickup truck. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to keep telling you about the next bite at the apple. In 2000, which was the drinking age had been lowered, but the amount of alcohol in your blood that counted you as intoxicated, still in most states, was 0.1%. That is 0.1% of your blood was alcohol, then you were considered to be intoxicated. And they wanted to lower that from 0.1 to 0.08, meaning from 0.010% to 0.08%, if you're with me here, to define you as being intoxicated. And again, the way they did it was through the transportation bill, in the same way that it had been done, by saying that if you don't lower the legal limit to 0.08, then you will lose federal funding. And again, you're absolutely free not to lower the legal limit to 0.08. That is absolutely your right as a state, as a sovereign state. Don't lower your legal limit to 0.08. But if you don't lower your legal limit to 0.08, you are going to lose funding. I have no idea what, I got to take off, hold on, I got to take off my virtual background. I think this is not going to work with my virtual background. So let's go out of the SAR High School library and into my kitchen. The things you get me to do, Rabbi Kroll, I'm telling you, I don't know, here I am, 43 years old and succumbing to peer pressure. That is my Chevy Silverado from Montana. And that's me and my Chevy Silverado and my cabin in Pole Bridge, Montana, year-round population 12, which swells in the summer to 100, and the grizzly bear population is about 400. It was actually awesome. The voting age is determined by the federal government, not the drinking age, but the voting age. And the voting age was lowered to 18 by a constitutional amendment. And that happened actually in the midst of the Vietnam War, with the logic being that if you could be sent off to die for your country, you should be able to vote for the person sending you off to die. We now have the rather illogical situation that you can be sent off to die for your country. You can vote for the person sending you off to die, but you can't buy a beer. But that is, in fact, the legal state of affairs in the United States. I did not see a grizzly bear carry cone. I did see black bears. I have pictures of them too. But fortunately, I did not see any grizzly bears. My mother was on here before. I don't know if she's still on here. I don't think my mother quite realized what I was doing when I went to Montana. I don't think she realized I was going to be hiking alone by myself in Glacier National Park, where there really are grizzly bears, on a 14-mile hike where for hours I didn't see another human being. I think my mother found out that I was doing that after I did it, and she was very glad she didn't know that I was doing it before I did it, because she found the whole thing very unnerving. There's not a lot of cell phone reception in Glacier National Park. It's just like you in the wilderness, and if a grizzly gets you, too bad. How sad it was. Nice knowing you. I'm here today. The grizzlies didn't get me. Let's go back to the federal government. So again, same tactic, using the power of the purse to accomplish what Congress didn't directly have the power to do, which is to dictate what the legal limit for intoxication would be. You don't have to accept a legal limit for intoxication, but if you don't, you just don't get the highway funding. And so what we did here is we picked out a few different episodes. Actually, before we do that, let's just stop and see if there are questions, comments, anything anybody wants to say. Probably more. Let's try to keep this more focused on the powers of the federal government and less focused on Montana, although I'm always happy to talk about Montana. Questions, comments, anything anybody wants to say on the subject of the powers of the federal government or how it wields them? No, we're all distracted by thoughts of Montana. Okay, so we will just sum up and wrap up. So what we see here is that the structure of the United States government is one that grants certain powers to the central government, but they're actually limited powers, and that the other powers are held in the hands of the states. That over time, the arc that we have seen across American history is of increasingly moving power towards the federal government, centralizing power in the hands of the federal government, although there is, I should just mention, a big legal and political push now to reverse that. It'll be interesting to see what, if anything, happens with that. But the arc to this point has been increasing power in the hands of the federal government, and that in times of mass death, when the federal government has to respond to mass death of one sort or another, whether that's war, whether that's pandemic, whether that's a more slow-rolling mass death on the nation's highways, as the federal government steps in to respond to that, we see changes in how it uses its powers, what powers it takes, how it uses them, and then what the ultimate impact of that is in ways sometimes that change the relationship of the federal government to the states for the people for the long term, sometimes have salutary effects, sometimes have less than salutary effects. But Jonathan Kroll wants to know how the CDC fits into this. Lisa Schaefer asks how this relates to the current pandemic. So the history of the federal government's involvement with science and medicine is its own whole interesting history. It actually starts, first sort of science-based agency of the federal government. Anybody know? Late 19th century. Put it in the chat if you know. Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture is actually very old as a cabinet department, and it was to try to, all the things the Department of Agriculture does, develop new strains of wheat and improve farming techniques and better crop yields and all kinds of things like that. Department of Agriculture is sort of the first federal government branch that deals with science, and then increasingly, okay, so that's a great question, and that would depend on exactly how you think about technology and science. When I said that, I meant research. Yes, absolutely. The Patent Office is established, as we said, the Constitution itself calls for the right to patents, intellectual property law. But in terms of scientific research, the first time the federal government is doing scientific research is in these agricultural extension offices that are arms of the Agriculture Department. And that through into the early 20th century, that expands. The FDA is established in the first decade of the 20th century, the Food and Drug Administration, to make sure that your food is actually food and not whatever else it was, and that your medicines work. That's a good thing, that they're safe and effective. And the federal government takes increasing roles. The National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation are established shortly after World War II, as science seems to take on an increasingly important role in helping pursue the Cold War and everything else. You get the establishment of the NSF and the NIH. The real issue there is a different issue, is not the research piece of it, which is like a sort of side thing. National Institutes of Standard and Technology is also a pretty early science-based office. National Weather Service is a pretty early science-based office. Those are all late 19th century. National Weather Service already exists in the late 19th century and is trying to track hurricanes with whichever technology existed in the late 19th century. So the federal government doing scientific research is really a pretty old story. The more challenging question is, what is the federal government's power to do things like order shutdowns, order stay at home, right? All those sorts of things. But what we're seeing here in this case, in our case today, is an interesting and different question, because the federal government is not seeking to do that. It's not trying to do that. It's not a question of what is the federal government power to do those things. The federal government in this moment has chosen to say we are devolving that power back to the states. Let the governors handle that, which is not the response to that we usually see in moments like this where the federal government says, okay, we got this, we're stepping in, we're taking over. But instead, there's a very clear and conscious strategy to leave that back in the hands of the states. And that has led to some of the things it's led to, as we all know, which is very differential sorts of responses to states, which turns out to be problematic because people travel back and forth between states and viruses do as well. So this is actually not a moment where we're testing the power of the federal government. It's actually a time when the federal government has kind of stepped back and is not trying to take power or exercise power. Any other questions, comments, things we want to say about the federal government and how it responds to mass death or Montana?
Can I speak?
Sure.
Oh, great. So isn't it reasonable, though, that different states would have different reactions? That obviously our response in New York may be different than Montana, for example.
Right. The idea of having the federal government step in would not necessarily be that the same response has to be in place everywhere. It would be a coordinated response. Meaning you might say, as the Trump administration actually put out guidelines that said, these are the guidelines for reopening. If you've had 14 days of declining caseloads, and if you've had, and then that would allow for differential response in different states. But although those guidelines were put out, they are not being followed by governors in all states, and they're not being imposed by the federal government. So there are states that are reopening now that do not meet the guidelines that were put out by the Trump administration, but aren't being enforced by the Trump administration. So you could say, everybody has to, you can only reopen once caseloads have been declining for 2 weeks, and then some states could reopen and some states could not. So having a coordinated policy doesn't have to mean everybody's doing the same thing, right? Montana is different than New York, and things might play out differently there. But the idea would be to have one coordinated effort across. Dog tags begun how many years after the Civil War? I'm not sure. Google will tell you instantaneously, but I believe that dog tags is a World War II thing. They're much later on. But you can research that and find out. And if I am wrong, we will know in a moment. There are no more unknowns. We can end with this, right? Now that there's DNA testing, they took the unknown remains from Vietnam out of the Tomb of the Unknowns. They identified them and returned them to the family, and they're not trying to find another set of unknown remains from Vietnam. And the assumption is that there will be no more unknowns in the Tomb of the Unknowns now that we can do DNA testing. It's a whole different story. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We will continue this series next Wednesday night and 2 more Wednesday nights after that, always pairing a Judaic studies and a general studies educator from SAR High School to talk about some aspect of something that we do study, think is interesting, that connects to our current times and our current situations. Have a good night.